What if the Cold War never took place, not because tensions didn't exist, but because one side had already decisively won? Picture a world where the Soviet red banner flies not just over Moscow and Berlin, but over Paris, Rome, Madrid, and even London. In this alternate timeline, the final stages of World War II played out very differently. The Allies do not meet in Berlin. Instead, the Red Army marches westward without pause. And by 1947, all of Europe, east and west, is under Soviet command, a world remade by communism. To truly understand how this could unfold, we must first examine the historical fork in the road. In our reality, the Soviet Union stopped its advance in Central Europe, creating the infamous Iron Curtain. But what if Stalin, buoyed by his massive army and driven by ideological conviction, ordered his forces to push past their historic limits? The United States, war-weary and politically hesitant, might have chosen not to confront the Soviets directly. Britain, bombed and nearly bankrupt, could have sought survival over resistance. This strategic vacuum would have given the Soviets the perfect opportunity to roll across Western Europe with minimal resistance. As tanks rolled through the cobbled streets of Vienna, Munich and Milan, resistance would have been sporadic and disorganized. Most governments, having barely re-established order after Nazi occupation, would be incapable of mounting a coordinated defense. The Red Army's momentum, numbers, and psychological warfare would overwhelm fragmented national forces. In some places, local communist parties, already growing in strength after fighting fascists, might welcome Soviet liberation. In others, terror and brute force would do the job. By 1948, the last European capitals fall. Lisbon, Madrid, and even London find themselves negotiating terms. The British Isles, unable to rely on American reinforcements that never come, are subjected to a naval blockade and devastating internal strikes. The monarchy abdicates, and a People's Republic of Britain is declared under heavy Soviet supervision. Churchill, revered in our timeline, might become a hunted exile or a martyr to resistance. With the continent now blanketed in red, the traditional balance of global power vanishes overnight. The United States, isolated across the Atlantic, becomes a refuge for displaced aristocrats, intellectuals, and political exiles. Immigration to the US spikes, bringing with it not just people, but ideologies, fears, and a deep, existential anxiety about a communist future. American politics take a sharp turn toward militarism and nationalism, spurred by fears of Soviet encroachment. The Red Scare becomes not a phase, but a defining feature of American life. Back in Europe, daily life transforms drastically. Soviet systems of governance are rapidly implemented, parliaments are dissolved, elections become rubber stamp ceremonies, dissenters vanish into gulags or are re-educated. A new generation grows up in a Europe that speaks the language of Lenin, not Locke. Schools rewrite history, casting capitalism as the villain of the past and socialism as the salvation of the masses. Marxist slogans are painted on cathedrals, palaces, and the walls of ancient universities. Religious institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, face brutal repression. The Vatican, now encircled, becomes a resistance hub, but even it must operate underground. Churches are converted into museums or meeting halls for state ideology. Icons of saints are replaced with portraits of Lenin and Stalin. Priests are imprisoned or executed under charges of anti-Soviet propaganda. The spiritual heart of Europe is extinguished in favour of atheistic materialism. Culturally, the continent becomes a paradox. On one hand, there is a widespread literacy, healthcare, and employment. On the other, creativity is shackled. Films must glorify the state. Novels must end with the triumph of the proletariat. Music must follow approved themes of unity, labour, and struggle. Jazz, rock, and any Western musical influences are banned or co-opted into Soviet forms. Picasso is labelled subversive. Sartre becomes a state-approved philosopher only if he praises collectivism. Yet even in such a grim system, there are pockets of resilience. Secret clubs distribute banned literature. Copies of Orwell, Camus, and Solzhenitsyn passed from hand to trembling hand. Underground artists use abstraction to communicate protest. Secret radio transmissions from Iceland or neutral nations keep the dream of freedom alive in whispered tones. Meanwhile, on the world stage, the geopolitical landscape is transformed. With Europe lost, the United States shifts its entire strategic focus. South America becomes a zone of competition as both superpowers attempt to sway governments. Africa becomes a Cold War battleground, not between East and West, but between the United States and a united Soviet-controlled Europe. The Middle East, now sandwiched between Soviet client states in Turkey and potential revolutionary movements in Egypt and Iran, becomes a powder keg. China, still undergoing its own communist revolution under Mao, finds itself in an uneasy alliance with the USSR. But with Europe in Soviet hands, tensions rise over who truly leads the communist world. Border skirmishes erupt in Central Asia. Eventually, ideological and strategic differences explode into a brutal but limited conflict, a communist civil war between Chinese and Soviet-backed forces in Mongolia and Kazakhstan. Technology also takes a radically different path. With Europe's immense scientific and industrial base unified under Soviet command, the USSR accelerates research. German rocket scientists, who in our timeline went to the United States, are now working in secret Soviet labs. The space race begins not between NASA and the Soviet Union, but between different factions within the Soviet system itself. By 1962, a Soviet-European spacecraft orbits the Moon. By 1975, a manned mission to Mars is in preparation. And yet prosperity remains elusive. Central planning, while effective in warfare, proves inefficient in peacetime. The enormous bureaucracy needed to administer such a vast empire breeds corruption and inefficiency. Agriculture in the Ukraine suffers under collectivization. French factories slow under strict quotas. Italian industries, once vibrant, now falter under endless red tape and mismanagement. Oran-guerre discontent simmers. In Paris, students stage silent protests. In Warsaw, workers sabotage rail lines. In Madrid, poets write verses that no one dares publish. These sparks begin to coalesce into underground movements, networks of intellectuals, artists, and labourers who want not capitalism but freedom. The Soviet leadership responds with both reform and repression. A new General Secretary promises modern socialism and introduces superficial reforms, limited press freedoms, mild economic flexibility, but the core remains unchanged. Surveillance is everywhere. Families inform on each other, entire villages vanish overnight under suspicion of Western influence. In this Europe, America becomes a symbol of forbidden dreams. Levi's jeans, Coca-Cola, jazz records, and photographs of Times Square are traded like relics. Young people huddle around shortwave radios to hear forbidden voices from across the sea. American culture, ironically, becomes more powerful as myth than as reality. By the 1980s, the cracks are widening. A generation raised in the shadow of Soviet unity now questions it. In Berlin, graffiti appears on Stalinist monuments. In Prague, ghostly concerts are held in abandoned churches. In Rome, workers go on strike not for wages, but for dignity. Then comes the digital age. Despite efforts to suppress it, computer technology leaks into the bloc. A black market for computers and satellite equipment emerges. Information begins to flow. It becomes impossible to stop. One leaked video of a protest in Budapest goes viral across illegal networks, inspiring coordinated mass protests. Police fire into crowds. The images spread. Martyrs are made. Finally, in 1999, it begins. The Red Autumn. Riots in Warsaw, Paris, and Athens. Soldiers refuse to fire on their own people. State buildings are occupied, flags are burned, leaders flee. By 2002, the Soviet European Empire collapses, not with a bang, but with 1,000 voices crying enough. In the aftermath, Europe is shattered but reborn. Nations begin the long process of rebuilding democracy. But decades of state control have hollowed institutions, destroyed trust, and bred cynicism. Some nations turn to authoritarian populists, others embrace rapid westernization. A new European Union is formed, this time not for trade or defense, but for healing. And what of Russia?
Now, in 2025, we look back on this alternate past and wonder, was the cost of control ever worth it? Could a world united by force ever truly be united at all? Or is the messiness of democracy, the chaos of freedom, the better path? A Soviet Europe would have meant scientific advancement, security, and social stability, but it would have cost the continent its voice, its soul, and its creativity. It would have smothered the Renaissance spirit in concrete. In the end, perhaps freedom, with all its dangers, remains the most human of ideals. Because history has shown again and again that the human spirit cannot be caged forever. The truth finds a way to break through walls, however high they are built. So the next time you walk through the streets of Paris or Berlin, free to speak, protest, create, and dream, remember that in another world, those freedoms were only whispers in the dark.